Good morning, welcome everyone. Today is Wednesday, we got our reset in Europe as well, and we find ourselves in the second part of our meta update for the week, for the end of last week, we should say. This time, after going through the raid yesterday, today is the time for Mythic Plus. Let's just throw at you a barrage of numbers about what happened last week in Mythic Plus. From the specs, from how many specs were in dungeons, how they performed to the dungeons themselves, how difficult they were, how challenging, a ranking of the difficulties of dungeons, although I am pretty sure you already know which have been the more difficult ones last week, but let's start first instead with the popularity of the specs. That's more important at the moment. So this is the popularity of the tanks in all keys. So we are not making any distinctions yet. We are still looking at just all of the keys, and Protection Warrior is the pick at the moment. The popularity, I have to say, is slightly worse than the start of Shadowlands in terms of variety, in terms of evenness of tanks. Prot Warrior is a bit above the rest. Does it get that much worse when you start looking at high keys? And since we are at the start of the season, we are looking at plus 15 as the breakpoint, as the threshold for high keys. So when you look at the tanks in high keys going at and past the 15 level, you see that Protection Warrior starts reaching the 40-ish% mark. Now, yes, it might be a little bit worrying that even just 1 week into the season you have 40% of all of your tanks being Protection Warriors, right? It's also worrying that 3 different tanks, so 50% of your tanks are basically at or below 10% of representation, so that's also kind of worrying. Prot Warrior, Blood Death Knight and Vengeance are keeping up a little bit more compared to the rest. We will see though, if we want to use the ultimate copium explanation, we still have to get all of these tanks, their tier sets, their tier pieces, the 2-piece and the 4-piece set bonuses, and more item level. So maybe this might change a little bit more. After all, we have already seen a hotfix balance tuning this week happening right now, and also more balance tuning happening in patch 10.0.5, coming out likely in January. Still though, there are really no changes to tanks. It's not that in this hotfix Protection Warrior was nerfed, and in 10.0.5 there are nerfs planned for Protection Warrior. So at the very least, at the moment, this type of dominance seems to continue when it comes to tanks and to Prot Warrior as the main pick. Then as a pick, we have healers. Healers are the ones that change the least, because this is what you see in Mythic Plus in all key levels. So predominant representation of Restoration Druid and Preservation Evoker, but still, I would say, somewhat healthy representation of Holy Paladin, Restoration Shaman, and Holy Priest. Now, what does it change when you jump up in key level and enter plus 15 only? Well, you see, it's actually not that big. You know, Holy Paladin goes up 1%, Holy Priest goes up 2%, Restoration Druid goes up 3%, at, of course, the losses of Discipline, Resto Shaman, and Mistweaver Monk. So it's an increase, but it's not nearly as much of an oppressive increase as the increase of Protection Warrior. And also, at the very least for now, there isn't just one of the specs being played, there is a minimum of 2, not to mention Holy Priest at 16% is also doing quite fine at the moment. This is, so far, still following up our predictions from Prot Warrior being the 2-go tank, to Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker being the 2-go healers when it comes to Mythic Plus. So let's see how it continues when we look at the popularity of the melee DPS. So we start the melee DPS at overall levels of keys, with Fury Warrior being the overall most broth DPS together with Havoc Demon Hunter. Just below them you have Rogues, in particular Outlaw and Windwalker Monk, and then one more tier below them you have Feral Druid, Enhancement Shaman, Unholy, Death Knight, and Retribution Paladin. These seem to be at the moment the 2 different tiers of popularity of melee DPS. What if we start being a little bit more exclusionary? What if we start jumping into keys at plus 15 and above? Well, Warriors lose out a little bit more and Rogues gain a little bit more, because the result is that Windwalker Monk becomes even more popular, that Havoc Demon Hunter also grows a tiny bit, and the biggest growth goes to Outlaw Rogue, almost doubling the representation from all keys to +15s onwards. So of course, the result is that many of the other specs get brought less and less. For example, red goes from 8 to 3.5%, so they lose more than half of their entire player base. That's perhaps the biggest loss out of all specs. Some other specs don't lose nearly as much. For example, enhancement is still in the 8-ish%, and feral is losing just a tiny bit. But again, we do see a clear divide at the moment. You do have Havoc, Windwalker, and Outlaw as the three primary picks once you start getting into higher level of keys in Mythic Plus. Then we have our last role being the range DPS. So at first, once again, the massive popularity of Hunters brought us a divide between Marksmanship and Beast Mastery, both of them being together amongst the most played of specs, together with Demonology Warlock and with Devastation Evoker. Now, this is quite wild at the moment. You also saw a head-to-head fight between Arcane and Frost Mage in Mythic Plus, but once you start going into high keys, the situation changes wildly, because number one, when it comes to Hunters, Beast Mastery is on its way to going extinct. Most of the Hunters completely switch over to Marksmanship when it comes to Mythic Plus. When it comes to Mages, you have a prevalence of Arcane Mage in Mythic Plus once you start getting into high key levels, and then Demonology stays the dominant pick when it comes to range DPS, and in all of this, the other spec that loses out the most is Devastation Evoker, because they go from 14 to 9.5%, so they lose roughly 50% of the representation from normal keys, all key levels to +15 key levels. So these have been the main changes, as long as just the popularity, just the amount of specs being brought into certain keys from all levels to the high levels at the moment in the first season, in the first week of the first season of Dragonflight Mythic Plus. What if we go a little bit deeper though? So this one, for example, is a summary of a tier list based on the amount of keys and the level of keys completed by each spec on average. There are of course some surprises, like for example Subtlety, making it very high when it comes to melee DPS. You also have Balanced Druid, which we haven't mentioned much, also making its way when it comes to range DPS, and a Prot Paladin out of nowhere, being above the other 4 tanks, but still massively behind Protection Warrior. What might also jump to your eye right now is that there are multiple specs, multiple melee specs in the A tier and one in the S tier, but when it comes to range DPS, there is only one spec in those 2 tiers, which is Demo. All the other specs are below. All the other specs are performing not nearly as much when it comes to being a range DPS in Mythic Plus keys. This might be explained, we might get some explanation in other ways. For example, we can take a look at the success rate of each spec, each individual spec in their keys, and also the average score of those keys. So just to see how high are the keys that they are completing. And as you can see, besides the outlier at the top of Fire Mage with just 93 runs, sort of breaking the whole list, besides Fire Mage, all of the highest success rate chance picks right now in Mythic Plus are, here's the hint, okay, here's the hint. Subtlety Rogue, Outlaw Rogue, Assassination Rogue, Windwalker Monk, Enhancement Shaman, Havoc Demon Hunter. This is the top 6. Now, what do these 6 specs have in common? Yes, correct. They are all melee specs. That is perhaps why melee DPS is currently showing up as being of a higher tier than ranged. At the moment, they are performing better overall in Mythic Plus compared to ranged specs. So there can be quite the gaps in terms of success rate, but then again, it's just been a week, right? Talking about success rate, we don't just have the success rate of the specs themselves, because dungeons can vary in difficulty as well. So I'm sure many players have experienced some growing pains in certain dungeons based on the difficulty, on the tuning of those dungeons. I'm sure you have made your own opinions yourself about the differences in difficulty between, for example, dungeons like Shadowmoon Burial Grounds compared with Ruby Life Pools, just to name a couple of them. This was our ranking for the first week of the Mythic Plus keys. A very easy top 2 of Burial Grounds and Court of Stars. So all their dungeons, basically, all their dungeons are making the top 2. In the middle you had Algetar Academy, you had Nokod Offensive and Halls of Valor. At the bottom you had Azure Vault, Temple of the Jade Serpent, and more importantly, Ruby Life Pools all the way down to the bottom. But if you want an even more detailed explanation of how much of a difference you had between keys, this is the more detailed explanation. So, on a fixed amount of runs, on an even amount of runs for all of the dungeons, you can have upwards of a 65+% chance of timing the key or not between the best one, Boya Grounds, and the worst one, Ruby Life Pools. Ruby Life Pools with a 31% completion chance in the first week of the expansion. So, very, very prone to being depleted as a key. Then, as you start getting past Nokkud Offensive, the top 3, Algetar Academy, Court of Stars, and Shadow Moon Boya Grounds are all at or above the 60-ish% mark, with, of course, Boya Grounds being the massive outlier in how undertuned it is. Really, really, really simple at the moment. Now, I don't want to invoke your PTSD, but I will remind you that the first week of Shadowlands saw dungeons like Necrotic Wake and Sanguine Depths at below 15% completion rate. So, if you think Ruby Life Pools is terrible right now, is sitting at a 30% rate, then imagine it twice as bad. Imagine all the way back to pre-nerf Necrotic Wake was twice as bad, at the very least, of Ruby Life Pools. That's how overtuned it was. So no doubt still that these dungeons will still receive a hand of tuning. I am in fact being surprised that we haven't gotten any dungeon hotfixes so far. Maybe since I am coming from a few hours in the past. In the meantime, Blizzard will have dished out a large round of hotfix nerfs to these overtuned dungeons at the bottom, or maybe even, we have to be honest here, some buffs to the more forgiving dungeons at the moment, like Boya Grounds or Court of Stars, for example. Those should also be warranted, if we have to be honest, even if they're gonna make our key grind worse. Those are still not quite tuned as well at the moment. We can then finish with the composition variety, because we are now gonna see also how and which type of specs and compositions are you more likely to see in your groups. Not just to see the popularity of the individual specs, as we have already seen. We already know Protection Warrior, for example, is the more popular tank, or Restoration Druid and Preservation Evoker are the more popular healers, and Outlaw Rogue is the more popular DPS together with Havoc, right? We know that already. What about the compositions? Well, the tank, of course, starts in a surprising manner, because these are the more popular tank in the first dozen or so of the most played 5-man compositions in Mythic Plus. Yeah, kind of expected. Then we move on in the combo of healers. These are the healers getting paired together with the more popular tank. That's also kind of expected. A zigzag of dark green and orange of these two specs being played. But then these are the DPS. As you can see, we do have an overall majority of double melee DPS comps. As a matter of fact, even though we do see some marksmanship and some demonology, right? There is some. It's not that they're gone, but there is not a single composition out of this top 12 of most played comps that uses both of them at the same time. Every single one of these comps either uses Outlaw and Havoc with Demo or marksmanship, or Outlaw and Windwalker with Demo and marksmanship. So at the moment, essentially, Protection Warrior is not missing from any of the top compositions. At the moment, also Outlaw is not missing from any of the top compositions. And then the remaining 2 DPS spots of the top compositions are a fight between 4 specs for 2 spots: Havoc, Windwalker, Demo, and marksmanship. And then you have the 50-50 of Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker at the moment. In case you were wondering, 96 is the answer. We have to scroll down to the 96th most played composition to find a non-Protection Warrior tank, which would be Vengeance. Vengeance, Resto Druid, Marksmanship Hunter, Outlaw Rogue, and Windwalker Monk is the first of the most used non-Protection Warrior comp. So that is the current winner, the current non-Prot War winner in terms of compositions. So Outside of this, when it comes to composition popularity as well, we have looked at most of the things we could see and we could take a look at on this first week of Mythic Plus. Of course, this upcoming week, if still we have no nerfs incoming, will be a disaster, as we are about to get Tyrannical, Grievous and Bursting, which is even difficult to imagine how it's gonna be done, given how tough some bosses already looked on Fortified, so let alone during Tyrannical, and let alone during a Tyrannical plus Grievous week. So that looks like it will be quite a painful week for healers, I'm afraid. I'm still hoping, I'm still hanging on to my last half-broken tank of Copium, expecting some nerfs, some tuning at the very least, to some of these dungeons. But for the moment, this was the weekly recap of how things have been going in Mythic Plus so far. We will of course see much more changing as the hotfix buffs and nerfs have just gone live, as more and more of these specs get access to their 2-piece and their 4-piece set bonus. Also, a few more things might be bound to change. So, for the moment, we are pausing here, but we are still expecting things to keep changing and things to be fluid, at least for a couple more weeks, before we start seeing a more settled meta for the moment in Mythic Plus. So, with this out of the way, it's time to leave, and as always we take our leave, starting by thanking all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and supporting myself and this channel. That being said, you can still support in other ways that don't include having to fork out some cash. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are still acceptable ways to show your support. Furthermore, I am found to be followed on Twitter, especially if you want to keep track of whenever I go live on my stream. That would be a nice way to do so. You can also support me by subscribing to my Patreon to get access to my Discord server as well. And lastly, of course, I am found streaming on Twitch, starting, generally speaking, around 10 p.m. Central European times, 1 p.m. Pacific and 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. So with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, yesterday was a dud. The IRS definitely did not come to my house, but I believe it is still just a matter of time.